Welcome or welcome back. This is Pairs Wealth Knitting. I'm Jennifer, and this is a knitting podcast all about knitting, yarny adventures, and travel. Thank you very much for joining me today. So excited that you're here. Today we are talking about gauge. That's right, this entire episode is all about gauge. Some people find it a really dirty word in knitting. I have embraced it and am moving forward and enjoying the concept and the application of gauge. I'm here to share with you the tips and tricks I've learned along my knitting journey so far that have completely changed my knitting life, and I hope they change yours for the better. Stick around and we're going to talk all about gauge today. We'll start with what I'm wearing. It has great significance to bounce in to the topic of gauge. This is a Buggiflooer Beanie. That's right, I said beanie, by Alison Rendall. A gorgeous design that was prepared by Alison Rendall for the 2023 Shetland Wool Week. Every Wool Week annually there is a new design of a beanie, and knitters that attend the festival know that you can knit up the beanies as you go every year and have quite a collection in the end, which I think is such a lovely idea. I had knit this on recommend. Actually, they were smaller than the recommended needles. I still did not obtain gauge in the recommended yarn. This was the Jamieson 2-ply, and was just massive on my little cranium. I believe there was one size in my memory of the pattern. That's part of it because I do have a small head, and was still too big. So the reco from viewers, which was lovely, was to change it, mod it into a cowl, which it did, and it's a stunner. Love this. Didn't love that I wanted and intended to get a beanie and I didn't, which leads me to my gauge talk. The importance of gauge, I think, in knitting is almost everything. It heightens the element of joy because you were able to obtain this size, follow a pattern, and probably do less or potentially even no modifications unless you want to get a garment or a knit accessory. It's also going to have the fit. It's also going to have the aesthetic that you are after or that the designer intended, which you probably would like to mimic. I was in denial for many knitting projects, but we are there now. I've embraced, I'm enjoying. So let's get down and dirty with gauge, or down and clean, however you want to look at it. My entire objective today is to allow you to understand the importance of gauge, to understand the definition of gauge, and learn how to obtain gauge as we move forward in our knitting journey. It took me a very long time to understand the importance of this concept and to be able to apply it into my knitting life. Since I have, I cannot tell you the amount of joy that I have received in knitting or experiencing and wearing garments and accessories that are well made and fit beautifully and less ripping back. So I hope the tips and tricks today, along with some of the basics of talking about gauge, is helpful for you. Let's create a definition. So what is gauge? Gauge is a standard of measurement of a piece of fabric that we knit up as a sample, and is hopefully allowing us to be applying that tension to a garment or to an accessory where we were able to best pair that yarn and that pattern together to come out with the designer's intention without having to do any modifications, or at least minimal amount of modifications unless we desire to, that may change some little pieces that we would like to in the pattern. It's simply an estimate. And this estimate helps us go really far in having more joy in our knitting and wearing of our finished project. So now that we have the definition for gauge, we need to understand why it's mattering. Why do we even need to care about this? Why do we need to do this? Why do we have to match gauge of the pattern designer's intent? One, it's so that the pairing of yarn and pattern can go together, so you're able to follow the pattern and get the thing at the end that you're wanting and that the designer's intended. Part of that is with size. You are knitting to the size that's intended by the designer with the measurements that they have included in their pattern that you will then mimic and create in your hands. Doesn't sound like rocket science, but it kind of is. In creating a fabric that again is mimicking what the designer has put out, if you're seeing a picture, then you're recreating that picture and coming to life in your hands. And as well, yarn requirements. This is the amount of yarn that's needed to complete the project, hopefully with a buffer as well that you might have extra for just in case. And that allows you to know you're going to have enough yarn without running out for that project. These are really important things. So where are you going to get gauge from? You're going to get gauge from a number of places, and a good starting point is with the yarn. When we're looking at yarn, many ball bands, there are a few that I feel don't have this, but many ball bands will have information that include, this isn't coming in properly. Come on. There we are, I think. Gauge estimates. So this is telling us that, I hope it's coming in, that on a, what is it, a 3 or to a 3.5 millimeter needle, that you should be able to attain 25 stitches if you hold this yarn single. That's giving us some vital information and telling us about this yarn. Will you get this on this exact needle? You may not. We're going to talk about needle size in a second. This yarn, for example, it also has a very different version of how it's communicating gauge information to us. So it's telling us on a 4.5 to 5 millimeter needle that it's saying that we should get about 18 stitches per 10 centimeters or per 4-inch square. These are estimates, and they're giving us needle sizes with an estimate in mind. Every knitter has a different style of knitting, and it goes beyond even that English style or thrower or continental and European style knitter. It's about the fabric, it's about your needles. What kind of needles? Is it straight? Are they round? What kind of fabric are they? What kind of material are they? Wooden, metal? All these things are so important. Where are we? Are we knitting in the round? Are we knitting magic loop? So many things determine tension, our mood even, and perhaps where you are, how stressed you are could also come into factor with tension, which is why this is an estimate as well, keeping that in mind. So we want to create a swatch to start, to figure out what our gauge will be, at least the estimate. So what we can do is we can look at yarn, we can look at, see the recommended needle sizes that are given. And if you know nothing about your knitting tension, start here. That's how you can start with that type of yarn to see if you obtain gauge. Then you can see if you are above or below. So if you're a tight or loose knitter, we may have heard these terms before. If you're a tight knitter, you may need to go up in needle size. If you are a loose knitter, you may need to go down in needle size. I'm a loose knitter, I always need to go down in needle size to obtain gauge. We also want to look at a pattern. We can start with pattern or start with yarn. I think it depends on kind of our openness of purchasing pattern, purchasing yarn, or obtaining that or having that in our stash, because you don't have to start with yarn. You can start with a pattern, but it means you may not be able to be married to the yarn that you want to pair with the pattern if you haven't already swatched in that motif. There's so much information because I want to talk about that too. So we're talking about the swatch and allowing that to be our estimate for whatever we're knitting up. We have to knit a big enough swatch. The swatch should be at minimum the size of the gauge square that we want. So we're looking at a 10 by 10 centimeter swatch or a 4-inch by 4-inch square swatch. They always say a little bigger is better. this is what I tend to do. I tend to do the 10 by 10 or the 4 inch by 4 inch to give a rough estimate. You want to make sure that you're using, you're not married again to the needles. If the needles are telling you that you need, say, a 5mm needle to knit with, you may need a 4, you may need a 3, you may need a 7. You could have probably 5 different knitters knit a swatch with the same yarn and all need a different needle to obtain the same gauge. It's a really odd concept, but it is absolutely one that I've come across, that this is real life. This is very much an application. And whatever needles you use to swatch, and if your gauge is obtained, meaning it matches the gauge intended by the pattern, then that is the needle size that you'll be using to knit up that project. Clarifying that in the project, it may say that you are to use a specific needle size, but knowing, because you are not the knitwear designer, they are a very different human than you with probably very different knitting techniques and style, that you need to choose a needle size that's going to work for you best to get that gauge. If the knitwear is designing and using, say, a US 10, you may need a size up, a size down, or a couple sizes up or down to obtain that gauge. And people that say that they obtain gauge of every pattern of every knitwear designer, I have no idea how that's possible. If you were one of those people, please let me know, because in my brain and math and, you know, real life application, I don't understand how that would ever work. I don't know. In addition to creating a large enough swatch, we want to make sure that we are knitting a swatch that is in the motif indicated in the pattern. A good designer should have clarification as to what motif they want you to swatch with to get and measure that applies to that garment or that accessory. So for most things, we can think of simple stockinette, because if you are knitting a simple stockinette thing project, then stockinette, of course, is the desired swatch you're going to be knitting up. That mimics the fabric that you will be using in your project. If it's a cable work sweater, most likely the designer will tell you to knit a motif of that cable chart within your swatch and apply that to your estimate. That would be what you would be using to create your fabric. I'm thinking of an example when I knit the Moby pullover, which is a cable work sweater, that instead of doing the entire cable work motif, it was a moss stitch. So you had to knit a moss stitch and then that's applied. So again, following the designer's instructions are very helpful in order to help you attain gauge and have more success in choosing size and end product essentially of your knitwear item. Also determining how you're going to be knitting, if it's round or flat. A lot of people push to do a swatch in the round if you're going to be knitting in the round. I have found, and I know there's some workarounds around this. If you know of a great workaround, let us know. I do my swatches flat because I find when I am knitting a very small circumference, it can be quite a bit tighter than when I'm doing, say, big circumference in the round knitting. So then my gauge wouldn't apply appropriately and I wouldn't be choosing the right size. So I do knit flat for this. And also that we are knitting a swatch with, I think, hopefully the same tension that we would when we are knitting a project. For example, I think as I was struggling to try to obtain gauge, I would try to knit tighter by pulling the yarn in a different way than I normally would, or tension between my fingers in a different way, so that I could obtain gauge on the desired needle of the designer. That's really uncomfortable for me and not natural. And of course, when I go to switch and knit comfortably and enjoy my knitting project, I'm doing it in the way that I normally do, which is a lot looser. I'm tensioning a lot, less tight. And so of course my gauge doesn't match. So just making sure that you're knitting in the way of all the ways that you can think of when you're actually knitting and enjoying a project that are applied to your gauge swatch. The last is blocking with the piece of this part of gauge swatching, is making sure that you are washing or blocking in the way your gauge swatch in the exact same way you would do with your finished object. If you are only ever in your life going to steam block a piece, be it an accessory or a garment, then go ahead and steam block your gauge swatch. If you are literally wash blocking or wet blocking your garment accessory, that's how you would do your gauge swatch. Also thinking about pinning. If you are someone that enjoys pinning for different reasons, garments and accessories, then you may want to pin your swatch. If you're not a pinner for your end product project, I would suggest not pinning. I'm not a pinner. I like to press down my knitwear after wet blocking. That is my preferred method. So I never pin anything. The only thing I think I've ever tried to pin was a shawl because it had some lace work on it, and that's it. So again, you're treating the gauge swatch exactly as you would treat that end project. I think that's a good rule of thumb. Let's talk about how to measure. So we want to make sure that we are super specific in our measurements, that we are measuring our swatch in the way that the designer would intend as well, be that a 10 by 10 centimeter swatch or 4 inch by 4 inch centimeter swatch. That I find for me, using a flat ruler opposed to those measuring tapes can be a lot easier because it's able to press down on the fabric. I do find that when I'm pulling that measuring tape out, I also can kind of fudge the numbers a bit and pull or smush the fabric together. That's one of my little like personal tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. And then of course, making sure that you're counting your stitches accurately. I use actually a knitting needle to go into each little stitch to make sure that I'm counting it appropriately with my eyes instead of just my finger. I think it helps me really track my stitches. So when I'm counting my stitches, instead of just using my finger, I'm actually using a needle, and this is a hat, but it's okay. And I'm actually going within the stitch to count it as I have that flat needle, or I should say, sorry, flat ruler beside. So I'm going in and I'm counting, I'm lifting up the stitch sometimes, or sometimes I'm going within the stitch itself to count it so that I'm not missing any stitches, or I'm not incorrectly counting, to make sure that I get the proper measurement of what I'm doing. So of course, when we're talking about gauge swatch, we're looking at our row across. We want to make sure that this is the accurate amount of stitches, of course, for our sizing, but we're also counting up and down as well to make sure we're getting that row gauge. People don't talk about the row gauge as much because I think we can easily modify a lot of things. For example, a hat, we can just knit a little further. For a raglan sweater, we can continue on, but it is still it's a piece of the puzzle where it definitely determines if we follow that pattern like word for word, line for line. If we're not getting that row gauge, that can also throw us off, and we may have to make some pretty big adjustments if that's not being met. So now we can talk about comparing and adjusting, if need be, our gauge swatch. You may not get gauge on the first try using the specific needle that has been put out or suggested by the designer or even the yarn company. So you may have to swatch multiple times. And this is, I think, the piece that knitters can get bogged down by. We don't want to spend more time planning and preparing when we've already taken so much time to do the research on the yarn or the pattern. But it is part of that necessary piece. And I think when we think about making That planning process and preparing process really sets you up for success and a more joyful experience. I think about everything. I think about like sewing. The pieces I don't enjoy the most of sewing is putting together the pattern, sometimes from a PDF. I find that piece so unenjoyable, and as well cutting out the fabric. These are all pieces necessary to get to the actual making, which is so much better. And so I think we can start to think about gauge swatching like that. You may have to adjust your needles. Again, we already touched on that, going up or down, depending on the tension that you have to obtain gauge. You may have to swatch again, of course, using those other needles, or you may have to switch pattern or yarn. That specific yarn and that specific pattern may not always be the absolute best pairing. So allowing yourself sometimes to have that openness and flexibility. If you are married to the yarn, maybe she could use a new pattern. If you're married to the pattern, maybe you can be a little more open and go for a different yarn. It is a little, I think, challenging, especially when you have that clear vision in your head that you want to get into your hands and then onto your body. And if that's the case, and if you're absolutely determined and a, gung-ho knitter, go for it. Just know you will have to do modifications as you go, which could be the whole pattern. And I have done that many times before. So I would say if you are super determined to pair that very special yarn with that perfect pattern, but doesn't pair perfectly with gauge, it just means that you're going to have to do modifications. And if you want to and are able and have the patience and want to grow as a knitter, by all means, fabulous. If you want more of an easy ride, you want to follow the pattern, I would say then you have to adjust and account for those differences that need to happen. So you're either going to swap out the yarn or swap out the pattern completely. And just know you can always pair this with something different later. I find giving myself that time and patience, sometimes things come to you and you realize that that pairing that you had in your head that was such a beautiful vision but may not have worked out with gauge can become the next beautiful vision of something else. Right. So I hope that these pieces of gauge are helpful for you, understanding why gauge is mattering, why we have to do this, the significance of it, the definition, understanding what it is, what a good gauge swatch can look like and feel like, how we block or treat that swatch, little tips and tricks of how to measure, and then of course making the changes, I should say the adjustments moving forward to help you obtain gauge. And absolutely at the end, if these adjustments are not working, allowing yourself the grace to choose something better for yourself that does match gauge. I do hope that some of these tips and tricks have helped you, that you are going to be experiencing more joy in your knitting, and of course, be wearing your knits ever more proud. If you have any tips and tricks for us that help us obtain gauge or the application of gauge to a pattern or a yarn, please chime in and let us know to help our knitting community out. I really appreciate you being here today, and as always, so excited to share knitting stuff with you, so thank you. If you enjoyed the video today, I invite you very much to like and subscribe to the channel. In addition, I have patterns that I have just come out with. My latest was the plug and play slipover, so I invite you to click on the links to go check those out. I want to thank everyone that has given positive encouragement along the way, has said lovely things on Instagram or YouTube. Of course, for people that have gone ahead and purchased the pattern, I feel very lucky for being where I am and being such a fresh person into designing. I'd like to thank you very much for being here today. I really hope that some of the tips, tricks, and clarifications, possible suggestions in order to get gauge and what to do if you do not get gauge, have helped you today. I want to have you have more joy in your knitting, and just heighten that beautiful experience that we get to have hopefully every day, or at least when we do and knit, as well as have those pieces, the garments, accessories fit even better, and that we're ever more proud to be wearing and making what we make. Wishing you absolutely the best joy in your knitting, and wishing you all a happy gauge experience. Until next time, take care.